Margaret Morrison's 6 cats stared in silence as the pregnant bobcat collapsed on her lawn, the wild animal's body convulsing with failed contractions that would kill both mother and her unborn litter within the hour. What her smallest kitten did next. A 4-month-old orange stray weighing barely 3 pounds would defy every instinct, every boundary between wild and domestic, and ultimately rewrite the rules of survival itself. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The autumn sun hung low over the quiet suburban street in Boulder, Colorado, casting golden light across manicured lawns and well-kept homes. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon where nothing remarkable was supposed to happen, where life moved at the gentle pace of falling leaves and distant lawnmowers. But nature has a way of disrupting even the most ordinary moments, of bringing the wild into the tame in ways that defy all expectations. On this particular October day, something extraordinary was about to unfold in the backyard of the Morrison family home. Something that would challenge everything people thought they knew about the boundaries between domestic and wild, about compassion crossing species lines, and about the surprising heroism that can emerge from the smallest and most unexpected places. Margaret Morrison had been tending her herb garden when she first noticed the movement at the edge of her property. At 62, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on her head, Margaret had lived in this house for 37 years. She'd raised 3 children here, watched the neighborhood grow and change, and had seen her share of wildlife passing through. Deer occasionally browsing her roses, raccoons raiding the compost bin, even the odd fox trotting boldly down the street at dawn. But what emerged from the scrub oak and ponderosa pines that bordered her backyard made her freeze mid-motion, trowel suspended in her gloved hand. It was a bobcat, unmistakably wild with its tufted ears, spotted coat, and stubtail. But this wasn't the healthy, powerful predator Margaret had occasionally glimpsed from a distance over the years. This animal moved with visible difficulty, her swollen belly indicating late-term pregnancy, her gait unsteady and labored. The bobcat's normally sleek fur appeared matted and dull, and even from 30 feet away, Margaret could see the animal's sides heaving with exhausted breaths. The wildcat paused at the tree line, her amber eyes scanning the yard with an intensity that seemed to carry both caution and something else, something that looked almost like desperate hope. Margaret's 6 cats had been lounging in their usual afternoon spot on the back lawn, a mixed pride of rescues that had found their way to her home over the years. There was Oliver, the patriarch of the group, a massive orange and white tabby who'd been with Margaret for 12 years. His size and calm demeanor had earned him the unofficial title of family leader, though he ruled with gentle benevolence rather than any kind of aggression. Next to him lay Patches, a sleek gray and white female who'd been abandoned as a kitten and had grown into a dignified middle-aged cat with piercing green eyes. The others, Whiskers, a long-haired calico, Smokey, a solid gray tom, Mittens, a black and white tuxedo cat, and finally Pip, the newest and smallest addition to the family, a tiny orange kitten barely 4 months old who'd been found in a drainage ditch just 2 months earlier. All occupied their preferred spots on the lush grass. The domestic cats had noticed the bobcat's arrival before Margaret had, their heads turning in unison toward the wild visitor with varying degrees of interest and alarm. Smokey and Mittens had immediately risen to their feet, backs arching slightly in instinctive defensive postures. Whiskers had retreated several steps toward the house, her tail puffed to twice its normal size. But Oliver, perhaps because of his age or his natural confidence, remained where he was, watching the wild cat with steady, assessing eyes. Patches, too, held her ground, though her body language showed she was ready to bolt if necessary. Little Pip, with the fearlessness of youth and inexperience, actually took several curious steps toward the newcomer, his tiny orange form impossibly small compared to the wild predator. Margaret's first instinct was to call her cats inside, to remove them from any potential danger. She opened her mouth to do exactly that when something stopped her. The bobcat had taken another step into the yard, and now Margaret could see just how desperate the animal's condition truly was. The wildcat's legs trembled visibly, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. This wasn't a predator stalking prey or defending territory. This was an animal in serious distress, driven by some need so powerful it had overcome her natural fear of humans in domestic spaces. Before Margaret could move or speak, the bobcat took 3 more unsteady steps into the yard and then simply collapsed. Her legs folded beneath her, and she went down on her side in the grass about 20 feet from where the domestic cats had been lounging. The fall was ungraceful, final, the kind of collapse that speaks to total exhaustion, and perhaps something more serious. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the wildcat's sides continue to heave, her eyes half closed, her tongue lolling slightly from her mouth. The domestic cat's reactions were immediate and varied. Whiskers bolted for the house without hesitation. Smokey and Mittens retreated to a safer distance, but remained watching, their curiosity warring with their caution. Patches rose to her feet, but stayed in place, her green eyes locked on the fallen bobcat. But it was Oliver's response that surprised Margaret most. The big orange tabby stood slowly, his movements deliberate and calm, and began walking toward the collapsed wildcat. And right behind him, matching his slow pace with tiny, determined steps, was little Pip, the smallest member of the family, following his elder with the absolute trust that only the very young possess. Margaret wanted to call out, to stop them, but something made her hold her tongue. There was something happening here that went beyond her understanding, something that needed to unfold without human interference. Oliver approached the collapsed bobcat with measured steps, his large body moving with a grace that belied his size. Margaret had seen her cats interact with various creatures over the years, birds they'd caught and released, the occasional mouse, even a young rabbit once, but she'd never seen Oliver move with quite this combination of caution and purpose. Behind him, Pip's tiny orange form seemed absurdly vulnerable, a kitten barely past weaning approaching a predator that could easily be 3 times his weight, even in her current weakened state. The bobcat's eyes tracked Oliver's approach through half-closed lids, but she made no move to rise or defend herself. Her breathing remained labored, and now that Margaret's initial shock was wearing off, she could see other signs of the wildcat's distress. There was a distinctive smell in the air, something sharp and biological that Margaret's experience with her own cats helped her recognize. This wasn't just exhaustion or dehydration. The bobcat was in active labor, and something was clearly wrong. Oliver stopped about 5 feet from the wildcat, sitting down in a posture that somehow conveyed both respect and calm reassurance. Pip, following his lead but with less understanding, plopped down next to him, his tiny tail twitching with barely contained curiosity. For a long moment, the 3 cats remained frozen in this tableau, domestic and wild, large and small, experienced and innocent, all suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside normal time. Then the bobcat made a sound, low and guttural, not quite a growl, but something deeper, something that carried pain and desperation in equal measure. Her body convulsed slightly, her legs kicking out in an involuntary spasm, and Margaret realized with growing alarm that this animal wasn't just in labor, she was in serious trouble. The contractions appeared weak and uncoordinated, the kind of labor complications that Margaret had learned about years ago when one of her own cats had needed emergency veterinary intervention. Margaret pulled her phone from her gardening apron with shaking hands, her mind racing through options. The wildlife hotline, the emergency vet, animal control. But even as her fingers hovered over the screen, she hesitated. Any official response would take time, and this animal clearly didn't have time. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 40 minutes away on a good day, and with afternoon traffic, it could be over an hour. The bobcat's labored breathing and the irregular contractions told Margaret that waiting that long could be fatal. Patches had moved closer now, her initial caution overridden by something that Margaret could only describe as maternal instinct. The gray and white cat approached from the other side, mirroring Oliver's position but maintaining her distance. She sat down and began making a soft chirping sound, the kind of vocalization mother cats use to comfort their kittens. It was such an unexpected response that Margaret found tears suddenly blurring her vision. The bobcat's eyes, those wild amber eyes that should have been filled with fear or aggression at being surrounded by domestic cats and a human, instead held something that looked achingly like relief. Her head lifted slightly just for a moment, as if acknowledging the presence of these strange allies, and then dropped back to the grass. Another contraction rippled through her body, stronger this time, and Margaret saw the distinctive signs of active labor progressing. Little Pip, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation, stood up and took several more steps toward the bobcat. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat, visions of the wild cat lashing out in pain-driven instinct filling her mind, but Oliver seemed unconcerned. The big orange tabby watched his tiny companion approach the laboring bobcat with calm eyes, and when Pip got within 2 feet of the wildcat, Oliver simply stood and followed, positioning himself between the kitten and the bobcat's head, a gentle guardian ensuring safety for all involved. Pip, with the fearless curiosity of the very young, reached out one tiny paw and actually touched the bobcat's fur. Margaret gasped, but the wildcat's only response was to open her eyes more fully and regard the kitten with an expression that impossibly seemed almost grateful. The orange kitten, encouraged by this lack of aggression, moved closer still and then did something that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. He curled up against the bobcat's swollen belly, his tiny body pressing against her spotted fur, his purr suddenly audible even from Margaret's position 30 feet away. The bobcat's body relaxed fractionally at the kitten's touch, her labored breathing evening out just slightly. It was as if Pip's presence, his warmth, and his vibrating purr provided some kind of comfort that transcended species boundaries. Oliver settled down on the bobcat's other side, not touching her, but close enough that his presence was unmistakable. Patches joined them moments later, completing a circle of domestic cats around the wild predator in distress. Margaret made her decision. She walked slowly toward the house, keeping her movements calm and deliberate, and went inside to gather supplies. Clean towels, warm water in a bowl, her emergency pet first aid kit that she kept stocked for her multiple cats, and a soft blanket. She also grabbed her phone and dialed the emergency veterinary clinic, knowing they'd at least be able to provide guidance even if they couldn't send someone immediately. The call connected after 2 rings, and Margaret quickly explained the situation to the veterinary technician who answered. There was a pause, then the sound of muffled conversation as the technician consulted with someone else. When she came back on the line, her voice was professionally calm but tinged with concern. The vet on duty, Dr. Rachel Chen, would talk Margaret through what to do, but they had to be honest about the risks. A wild bobcat in distress could become aggressive unpredictably, and attempting to assist during labor could result in serious injury to Margaret or her cats. But given the animal's condition and the time it would take to mobilize proper wildlife resources, their best chance of saving both the mother and her kittens was for Margaret to provide immediate assistance. Dr. Chen came on the line, her voice clear and authoritative. She asked specific questions about the bobcat's condition, her breathing rate, the frequency and strength of contractions. Any visible signs of trauma or injury, Margaret answered as best she could while gathering her supplies, and Dr. Chen's assessment was grave. The bobcat was likely experiencing dystocia, difficult labor, possibly due to exhaustion, dehydration, or a kitten positioned incorrectly in the birth canal. Without intervention, both the mother and her litter would likely die. Margaret returned to the backyard, her arms full of supplies, her phone on speaker so Dr. Chen could continue guiding her. The scene that greeted her was even more surreal than when she'd left. Smokey and Mittens had joined the circle around the Bobcat, though they maintained more distance than Oliver, Patches, and Pip. The 6 domestic cats had essentially formed a protective ring around the laboring wildcat, their presence somehow calming rather than threatening. Even Whiskers had crept back outside and was watching from the safety of the porch steps, her curiosity finally overcoming her fear. The Bobcat's eyes tracked Margaret's approach, and for a moment the wildcat's body tensed, instinct warring with desperation. But then Pip, still curled against the Bobcat's belly, made a soft chirping sound, and Oliver lifted his head to regard Margaret with calm, trusting eyes. The message was clear. The big orange tabby was vouching for his human, extending his circle of protection to include Margaret in this unprecedented alliance. Margaret knelt slowly about 6 feet from the Bobcat, close enough to help but far enough to give the wildcat space. She spread the towels on the grass and set out her supplies, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite her racing heart. Dr. Chen's voice came through the phone speaker, steady and reassuring, walking Margaret through what to look for and what to do. The next contraction came hard, the Bobcat's body going rigid with strain, and Margaret saw what Dr. Chen had feared. There was no progress, no sign of a kitten beginning to emerge. The wildcat was exhausted, her body unable to complete the labor on its own. Dr. Chen explained that Margaret would need to check if she could feel a kitten in the birth canal, and if so, whether it was positioned correctly. It was a procedure that would require Margaret to touch the wildcat, to put her hands on an animal that could seriously injure her with a single reflexive strike. Margaret looked at Oliver, at the calm wisdom in the old cat's eyes, and then at little Pip, still purring against the Bobcat's belly. If her smallest, most vulnerable kitten could show such courage, such compassion, then she could do no less. She moistened a clean cloth with warm water, and moving with slow deliberation, reached toward the Bobcat. The wild cat's eyes widened, and a low sound emerged from her throat, but it wasn't quite a growl. Oliver immediately stood and moved to the Bobcat's head, positioning himself so that he was looking directly into the wildcat's eyes. What passed between them was beyond Margaret's understanding, some communication that transcended species and circumstance. The Bobcat's tense muscles relaxed fractionally, and she allowed Margaret's touch. Following Dr. Chen's careful instructions, Margaret examined the laboring cat. Her fingers found what she was looking for, the distinctive feel of a kitten caught in the birth canal, positioned wrong, preventing the labor from progressing. Dr. Chen's voice remained steady as she explained what Margaret needed to do. With the next contraction, Margaret would need to help reposition the kitten to give both mother and baby a fighting chance. The contraction came, and Margaret worked with gentle precision, her years of experience with her own cats guiding her movements. The Bobcat made a sound of pain, her claws extending and digging into the grass, but she didn't lash out. Pip pressed harder against her belly, his purr intensifying as if trying to offer what comfort he could. Oliver remained at the Bobcat's head, his solid presence an anchor of calm. Patches moved closer, adding her voice to Pip's, a chorus of purrs and chirps that filled the autumn air with unexpected music. Then suddenly, Margaret felt movement. The kitten shifted under her careful manipulation, finding the correct position. The Bobcat's next contraction was stronger, more coordinated, and Margaret saw the first signs of progress. A tiny nose appeared, then a head, and within moments the first kitten was born, sliding into Margaret's waiting towel. The tiny Bobcat kitten was perfect, spotted and wet, its eyes sealed shut, its mouth opening in a silent cry. Margaret quickly cleared its airways as Dr. Chen had instructed, using the corner of a clean towel to wipe away the birth fluids. The kitten's first breath came with a tiny mewling sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet backyard. The mother Bobcat's head lifted at the sound, her amber eyes fixing on her newborn with an intensity that made Margaret's throat tighten with emotion. Following Dr. Chen's continued guidance, Margaret placed the cleaned kitten near the mother's head, allowing the wildcat to sniff and identify her baby. The bobcat's tongue came out, rough and pink, and she began licking her kitten with instinctive maternal care. The action seemed to revitalize her, giving her exhausted body a renewed sense of purpose. Another contraction came, stronger than before, and Margaret understood that the successful birth of the first kitten had jump-started the stalled labor. The second kitten arrived more easily, the mother's body now working properly. This one was larger than the first, its spotted coat already showing the distinctive markings that would intensify as it grew. Margaret repeated her cleaning process, ensuring the tiny creature's airways were clear before placing it beside its sibling. The mother bobcat continued her grooming, alternating between her two babies with dedicated efficiency. Little Pip had remained pressed against the laboring mother throughout the birthing process, his presence a constant source of warmth and comfort. Now, as the second kitten was placed near the mother's head, the tiny orange domestic kitten stretched forward to sniff at the newborn bobcats. It was a gesture so innocent, so naturally curious, that Margaret found herself smiling, despite the tension of the situation. The mother bobcat paused in her grooming to regard Pip, and something passed between them. Mother to kitten, wild to domestic, a recognition that transcended normal boundaries. Oliver had moved to give Margaret more room to work, but he remained close, his watchful eyes missing nothing. Patches had positioned herself on the opposite side, her maternal instincts clearly engaged as she watched the newborns with intense interest. Even Smoky, Mittens, and Whiskers had crept closer, drawn by the primal drama unfolding before them. The 6 domestic cats had become midwives of sorts, their presence providing emotional support that seemed as important as Margaret's physical intervention. The third kitten arrived 10 minutes later, smaller than its siblings, its movements noticeably weaker. Margaret's heart sank as she cleaned this one, noting how its breathing seemed shallow, its tiny body less responsive than the others had been. Dr. Chen's voice came through the phone, urgent now, explaining that this kitten would need extra stimulation to thrive. Margaret rubbed the tiny creature more vigorously with the towel, trying to encourage stronger breathing, better circulation. The mother bobcat sensed the difference in this kitten immediately. Her grooming of the third baby was more intense, more focused, her tongue working frantically to stimulate her weakest offspring. But the kitten's responses remained sluggish, its tiny mews barely audible. Margaret exchanged a worried glance with Oliver, whose expression seemed to mirror her concern. Even animals understood when one of their own struggled at the edge of life. It was Pip who acted first. The tiny orange kitten, barely 4 months old himself, wiggled forward until he was pressed directly against the weak bobcat kitten. His purr, already audible, seemed to increase in volume and intensity. It was a sound that Margaret had read about in her years of cat ownership, the healing frequency that cats instinctively use to comfort themselves and others. Research had shown that cat purrs vibrated at frequencies that could promote healing, reduce pain, and even stimulate bone growth. Whether Pip understood this on some instinctive level or was simply responding to the distress of a fellow kitten, his actions were immediate and profound. The weak bobcat kitten stirred against Pip's warm body. Its breathing, which had been alarmingly shallow, seemed to deepen. The tiny creature's legs, which had been limp, began to move with more purpose. Margaret watched in amazement as Pip's continued presence and purring seemed to provide the exact stimulus the struggling kitten needed. The mother bobcat, recognizing that her baby was responding, intensified her own grooming efforts, working in tandem with the tiny domestic kitten who had appointed himself nursemaid. Dr. Chen's voice came through the phone, asking for updates, and Margaret described what she was witnessing. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Chen's professional composure cracked slightly. In all her years of veterinary medicine, she'd never heard of anything quite like this. A domestic kitten essentially performing rescue breathing through purr therapy on a wild bobcat newborn. It was the kind of story that would be dismissed as impossible if it weren't actually happening. The fourth and final kitten arrived 20 minutes later, this one healthy and vocal, its cries strong and demanding. The mother bobcat cleaned this last baby with visible relief, her maternal duties finally complete. 4 kittens, all ultimately breathing and moving, though the third remained noticeably weaker than its siblings. Margaret arranged fresh towels into a nest, and the mother bobcat, with careful deliberation, began moving her babies one by one into the prepared space. Throughout this process, Pip remained close to the weakest kitten, his tiny body pressed against it, his purr a constant vibration that seemed to flow through both of them. The mother bobcat paused each time she passed the orange kitten, sniffing him carefully, and each time she continued her work without any sign of aggression. It was as if she understood that this impossibly small domestic cat was helping her baby, that his presence was beneficial rather than threatening. Oliver supervised the entire operation with the calm authority of a seasoned patriarch. When the mother bobcat had all 4 kittens arranged to her satisfaction, she settled herself around them in a protective curve, allowing them to nurse for the first time. The sight of those tiny spotted bodies, no bigger than hamsters, latching onto their exhausted mother was almost too much for Margaret's already overwhelmed emotions. Tears streamed down her face as she watched life triumph over what had seemed like certain death just an hour earlier. Dr. Chen, still on the phone, had been consulting with the local wildlife rehabilitation center during the birthing process. The center's director, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who specialized in wild felines, was already en route. She'd been stuck in traffic when Margaret's emergency call had come through to the vet clinic, but she was now about 15 minutes away. Dr. Chen explained that Elena would assess the bobcat family and determine the best course of action. Ideally, if the mother had enough strength and the kittens were stable, they could be moved to a proper rehabilitation facility, where they could be monitored and eventually released back into the wild. But as Margaret watched the exhausted mother nursing her newborns, watched Pip curl up beside the weakest kitten as if he were part of the litter, watched Oliver and Patches maintain their protective vigil, she wondered if moving this fragile new family was really the best option. The bobcat had chosen this place, had trusted these domestic cats and this human enough to give birth in their presence. Was that choice something that should be respected or overridden in favor of protocol? The autumn sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the backyard. Margaret realized with surprise that over 2 hours had passed since the bobcat first collapsed on her lawn. 2 hours that had fundamentally changed how she understood the relationships between species, between wild and domestic, between instinct and compassion. Her 6 cats, who she'd always seen as individuals with distinct personalities, had revealed depths of empathy and intelligence that went beyond anything she'd previously imagined. Patches had moved closer to the nursing family, settling herself just outside the circle of towels. Her green eyes watched the bobcat kittens with an expression that Margaret could only describe as maternal longing. Margaret knew that Patches had been spayed years ago before Margaret had adopted her, but the cat's instincts clearly remained strong. Every few minutes, Patches would lean forward and sniff gently at the nearest kitten, her whiskers twitching with interest and concern. Smokey and Mittens had also maintained their presence, though they kept a more respectful distance. The 2 male cats seemed less interested in the kittens themselves and more focused on the mother bobcat, as if they understood she needed rest and protection while she was vulnerable. It was guard duty of a sort, something Margaret had never seen her cats perform before. Even Whiskers, the most nervous of the group, had ventured closer than Margaret would have thought possible, her curiosity finally overwhelming her natural caution. The mother bobcat's eyes had closed as she nursed her babies, her exhausted body finally able to rest now that the ordeal was over. But Margaret noticed that even in her depleted state, the wild cat's ears remained mobile, constantly adjusting to catch sounds from every direction. The mother's instincts were still sharp, still vigilant, even as her body surrendered to the need for recovery. One paw rested lightly over her kitten's, a protective gesture that was at once fierce and tender. Pip, the tiny hero of the afternoon, had finally stopped purring quite so intensely, but he remained pressed against the weakest kitten, his small body providing warmth and comfort. The struggling kitten seemed to have stabilized, its breathing more regular now, its movements stronger. Whether it was Pip's purring therapy, the mother's milk, or simple time and rest that had made the difference, Margaret couldn't say. But she did know that without the little orange kitten's intervention, that baby Bobcat might not have survived its first hour of life. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen, asking for a status update. Margaret sent back a quick message confirming that all 4 kittens were nursing and the mother appeared stable. Dr. Chen replied that Elena from the Wildlife Center would be arriving within the next 10 minutes and that Margaret should be prepared for the possibility that the Bobcat family would need to be transported immediately. The text ended with a note of admiration that made Margaret smile despite her exhaustion. Whatever happens next, Dr. Chen had written, what you did today was extraordinary. You saved lives that would have been lost. The sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway brought Margaret back to immediate concerns. That would be Elena, arriving with professional expertise and protocol that would determine what happened next. Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting after so long kneeling on the ground, and walked toward the side gate to let the wildlife specialist in. As she moved away from the scene on her lawn, she glanced back one more time at the impossible tableau behind her. A wild bobcat mother, exhausted but alert, nursing 4 impossibly tiny kittens, 6 domestic cats arranged in a protective circle around her, with the smallest kitten pressed directly against one of the bobcat babies. The autumn sun painting everything in gold and amber light, making the spotted coats of the wild cats shimmer like precious metal. It was a scene that belonged in a nature documentary or a children's storybook, not in a suburban backyard in Boulder, Colorado. Yet here it was, undeniably real. Challenging every assumption about territorial instincts and species boundaries, Elena Vasquez emerged from her truck with the efficient movements of someone who'd spent decades responding to wildlife emergencies. At 53, she had the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time outdoors than in, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical braid. She wore the khaki uniform of the Colorado Wildlife Rehabilitation Center and carried a large equipment bag that Margaret assumed contained everything from medical supplies to humane capture equipment. Her brown eyes, sharp and assessing, took in Margaret's disheveled appearance and the concern evident on her face. "You must be Margaret Morrison," Elena said, extending her hand. "Dr. Chen gave me the basics, but I'd like to hear directly from you what happened here." Her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that spoke to years of dealing with critical wildlife situations. As they walked toward the backyard, Margaret recounted the afternoon's events, from the bobcat's first appearance at the tree line to Pip's remarkable intervention with the weakest kitten. Elena's expression remained professionally neutral throughout Margaret's explanation, but her eyes widened slightly when they entered the backyard, and she saw the scene for herself. She stopped walking, her hand rising unconsciously to her chest, and simply stared for a long moment. "In 29 years of wildlife rehabilitation work," she whispered, "I have never seen anything remotely like this." Her voice carried a mixture of wonder and professional concern, the two emotions clearly at war within her. The mother bobcat's head lifted at Elena's arrival, her ears flattening slightly in warning, but Oliver, still maintaining his position as guardian, turned his calm gaze toward the new human arrival, and somehow that seemed to ease the wildcat's tension. Elena moved slowly, deliberately, keeping her body language non-threatening as she approached. She knelt at a respectful distance and opened her equipment bag, pulling out a pair of binoculars to get a closer look without approaching too near. Through the binoculars, Elena conducted a visual examination that took several minutes. She studied the mother's breathing, the condition of her coat, the alertness of her eyes, and most importantly, the kitten's. When she finally lowered the binoculars, her expression was thoughtful. "Margaret, the mother is severely dehydrated and exhausted, but given what she's been through, her condition is actually better than I expected. The kittens all appear to be nursing successfully, which is the most critical factor in their immediate survival." "What happens now?" Margaret asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Elena sat back on her heels, her gaze returning to the unusual family scene before them. "Normally, protocol would be to transport them immediately to our facility. We have proper enclosures, veterinary care on site, everything they'd need for monitoring and eventual release." She paused, and Margaret heard the unspoken "but" hanging in the air. "But," Elena continued, her voice measured and careful, "moving them right now could be extremely risky. The mother is exhausted, the kittens are only hours old, and there's one that's clearly struggling. The stress of capture and transport could potentially be more dangerous than leaving them where they are, at least for the next 12 to 24 hours. She turned to look at Margaret directly. "Plus, there's the unprecedented factor here that I'd be foolish to ignore." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. Though she thought she already knew, Elena gestured toward the circle of domestic cats. "Your cats have established a relationship with this mother that's allowing her to feel safe enough to rest and nurse. That trust, that calm environment, those are worth more than any medical facility right now. Stress is one of the biggest killers in wildlife rehabilitation, especially for mothers with newborns. If we remove her from this situation where she feels secure, even to take her somewhere objectively better equipped, we could trigger a crisis." Margaret felt a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. "So they can stay?" "At least for tonight," Elena replied. "I'll need to set up monitoring equipment, and I'll be staying here myself to observe. We'll need to get fluids into the mother somehow, preferably without having to sedate her, which carries its own risks in her weakened state." She pulled out her phone and began making notes. "I'll call the center and have them send over supplies, a portable enclosure we can set up in your garage as a backup, medical equipment, and additional staff for overnight observation shifts." Over the next hour, Elena transformed Margaret's backyard into a makeshift wildlife rehabilitation station. She set up motion-activated cameras at multiple angles to monitor the Bobcat family without disturbing them. She positioned a water station within reach of where the mother lay, hoping the exhausted cat would drink once she felt safe enough. She even rigged up a small tent-like shelter using stakes and a tarp, creating protection overhead in case the weather turned, which Colorado autumn evenings were prone to do. Throughout all this activity, the domestic cats maintained their vigil. Oliver had appointed himself chief supervisor, watching Elena's every move with assessing eyes, as if determining whether this new human could be trusted. Patches continued her maternal surveillance of the kittens, occasionally grooming herself as if to demonstrate proper motherly behavior. Smokey and Mittens had positioned themselves at strategic points around the yard, creating an outer perimeter of feline security. Even Whiskers, though still nervous, had claimed a spot on the porch steps where she could observe without being too close to the action. And Pip, remarkable little Pip, remained pressed against the weakest Bobcat kitten, his purr a constant background hum that seemed to steady not just the struggling baby but the entire scene. The tiny orange kitten's eyes would occasionally close in what looked like sleep, but his purr never stopped. His small body never moved away from his self-appointed charge. The weakest kitten, for its part, seemed to be gaining strength with each passing hour, its movements becoming more coordinated, its nursing more vigorous. Elena noticed Pip's dedication immediately. She photographed the scene from multiple angles, muttering under her breath about documentation and unprecedented interspecies behavior. Margaret caught fragments of her commentary. "The purring frequency," Elena was saying into a small recording device she'd pulled from her bag, appears to be having a measurable effect on the compromised kitten's stability. This is consistent with research on therapeutic purring, but I've never seen it applied cross-species in this manner. The domestic kitten, she paused to check the tag on Pip's collar, identified as Pip, appears to have instinctively understood what the Bobcat kitten needed and provided exactly that intervention. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to match Pip's coat, 2 additional staff members from the Wildlife Center arrived. Marcus Chen, a wildlife veterinary technician, and Lisa Rodriguez, a rehabilitation specialist. Both brought years of experience and, more importantly for the current situation, additional supplies and equipment. Margaret watched as they conferred with Elena in hushed tones, their eyes constantly returning to the unprecedented scene on the lawn. Marcus, a tall man in his early 30s with gentle hands and an even gentler voice, approached the Bobcat family with extreme caution. He carried a long pole with a small bowl attached to the end, the bowl containing a special electrolyte solution that Elena had mixed. The goal was to get the mother to drink without requiring human hands to come too close. It was a technique used with extremely stressed wildlife, allowing them to access resources while maintaining their comfort zone. The mother Bobcat watched Marcus's approach with wary eyes, her body tensing protectively over her kittens. But then something unexpected happened. Oliver stood up from his position and walked calmly toward Marcus, rubbing against the man's leg in the universal cat gesture of approval and greeting. It was as if the big orange tabby was vouching for Marcus, telling the wild mother that this human could be trusted just as the others had been. The effect was remarkable. The mother Bobcat's tension eased visibly, and when Marcus carefully positioned the bowl within her reach, she sniffed at it cautiously before beginning to drink. Her thirst was evident in how eagerly she lapped at the liquid once she determined it was safe. Marcus remained perfectly still, allowing her to drink her fill before slowly, carefully withdrawing the pole and bowl. The exchange had taken less than 2 minutes, but in those minutes Margaret saw the essential truth of what was happening here. Her cats had become bridges, translators of trust between wild and human. Lisa, meanwhile, had been setting up a night vision monitoring system that would allow them to observe the Bobcat family after dark without disturbing them with lights. She worked efficiently, running cables and positioning equipment with the ease of long practice. As she worked, she kept up a running conversation with Margaret about domestic cat behavior, clearly fascinated by how Margaret's cats were interacting with the wild Bobcat. "Your cats are extraordinary," Lisa said as she adjusted a camera angle. "I've worked with domestic cats in enrichment programs with captive wildlife, but those are carefully controlled situations with animals that have been socialized to each other over time. This is spontaneous, natural cooperation between species that should, by all conventional understanding, be competitors or at least mutually avoidant." She shook her head in wonder. "That little orange one especially, Pip, was it? He's performing complex caregiving behavior that we don't usually see in kittens his age, even toward their own species." Margaret felt a swell of pride for her cats, particularly for Pip, who had proven to be far more than just the tiny stray she'd rescued from a drainage ditch 2 months ago. She thought about that rainy afternoon when she'd heard mewing coming from the roadside, how she'd found Pip soaked and shivering, barely alive. She'd brought him home thinking she was saving a life, never imagining that the tiny creature would go on to save another life in turn, and in such an unlikely way. As darkness fell over the backyard, Elena made the decision to establish a rotating watch schedule. She would take the first shift, with Marcus relieving her at midnight and Lisa taking the dawn watch. Margaret insisted on being involved as well, arguing that this was her home and her cats, and she wanted to be part of whatever happened next. Helena agreed, assigning Margaret to shadow each specialist during their shifts, learning what to watch for and how to respond if the situation changed. The first night was long and filled with small miracles. Margaret sat with Elena in camping chairs positioned at a respectful distance from the Bobcat family. Both women wrapped in warm blankets against the October chill. They watched the monitor screens that showed various angles of the scene, supplemented by periodic direct observation using night vision binoculars. The Bobcat mother had settled into a deep but alert rest, her body curved protectively around her 4 kittens who nursed and slept in turn. Oliver had claimed a spot just outside the makeshift shelter, his large body a secondary line of defense. Patches had curled up nearby, close enough to provide companionship, but far enough to respect boundaries. The other cats had eventually retreated into the house for the night, with the exception of Pip, who absolutely refused to leave his post beside the weakest kitten. Margaret had tried twice to bring him inside, concerned about the dropping temperature and his small size, but the kitten had squirmed free both times and returned immediately to his spot against the Bobcat baby. Elena had finally solved the problem by bringing out a small heated pad, the kind used for wildlife rehabilitation, and positioning it beneath the towels where Pip lay. The warmth would benefit both the orange kitten and the Bobcat baby he was protecting. Pip had settled onto the heated surface with evident satisfaction, his purr resuming immediately, and had remained there ever since it was now past midnight, and the tiny kitten showed no signs of abandoning his charge. Around 2 in the morning, when Marcus had taken over the watch, something remarkable happened. The Bobcat mother, after hours of rest and regular drinking from the water station, suddenly lifted her head and looked directly at where Pip lay with her weakest kitten. For a long moment, she simply observed the tiny orange cat who'd been purring non-stop beside her baby for nearly 12 hours. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached out with one paw and gently pulled Pip closer, tucking him against her own body alongside her kittens. Marcus, watching through the night vision equipment, immediately called Elena and Margaret, who'd been resting in the house. They arrived to find Pip completely enveloped in the mother Bobcat's protective curve, the tiny domestic kitten now being treated as if he were one of her own litter. The sight was so unexpected, so completely outside the normal parameters of Bobcat behavior, that even Elena found herself momentarily speechless. "She's adopted him," Margaret whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Elena nodded slowly, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. "In all my years," she said quietly, "I've seen mother cats nurse puppies, dogs raise kittens, even unusual cross-species adoptions in captivity. But a wild bobcat, hours after giving birth under stress, accepting a domestic kitten into her litter, this defies every behavioral model we have." Marcus was documenting everything with both still photographs and video, his camera clicking softly in the darkness. "This is going to rewrite some textbooks," he murmured. The bonding hormones, the oxytocin released during and after birth, combined with Pip's presence during the labor and his continued caregiving behavior toward her weakest kitten, it's created a connection that's overriding her wild instincts. They watched as Pip, seemingly understanding the great honor he'd been given, settled into nursing position alongside the Bobcat kittens. He was too old to actually nurse, of course, but the motion and position seemed to comfort the mother, and more importantly, his continued purring and warmth continued to benefit the weakest kitten, who was nestled between Pip and its siblings. The little orange kitten's eyes closed in contentment, his purr never stopping, his small body radiating warmth and life into the fragile Bobcat baby beside him. The rest of the night passed in peaceful vigil. The Bobcat mother rested deeply, her body finally recovering from the ordeal of labor. Her kittens nursed regularly, their tiny bodies growing stronger with each feeding. And Pip, the smallest hero anyone had ever seen, maintained his position as honorary Bobcat, his presence accepted and even welcomed by a wild mother who'd been given every reason to trust in the kindness of unlikely allies. Dawn broke cold and clear, the autumn sun painting the backyard in shades of pink and gold. Lisa had taken over the watch at 5 in the morning, and by 6:30, Margaret's other cats were emerging from the house to check on their wild visitors. Oliver immediately resumed his guardian position, settling near the shelter with the calm authority of someone who'd never really stopped being on duty even while resting patches joined him, and soon Smokey, Mittens, and even Whiskers had claimed their various observation posts around the yard. Elena, who'd managed only a few hours of sleep, emerged from Margaret's guest room looking tired but energized. She immediately went to check the monitoring equipment and review the night's footage. What she saw made her call both Marcus and Lisa over, the three specialists huddling around the laptop screen, occasionally glancing at the living scene before them, and then back to the recorded evidence. "Margaret," Elena called out, "I need to discuss something with you." Her tone was serious but not alarmed, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as she approached. The specialist gestured for her to look at the laptop screen, which showed a time-lapse of the night's events. "You can see here," Elena explained, pointing to specific timestamps, how the mother's respiratory rate stabilized around midnight, how the weak kitten's movements became progressively stronger throughout the night, and how the entire family's stress indicators decreased dramatically. Margaret studied the footage, seeing what Elena was pointing out. The difference between the Bobcat mother's condition at dusk versus dawn was remarkable. Her breathing was deeper and more regular, her body more relaxed even while maintaining protective awareness. The kittens, too, showed increased vigor, their movements more coordinated and purposeful. "But is that good news or bad news?" Margaret asked, uncertain why Elena seemed so serious about what appeared to be positive developments. "It's complicated news," Elena replied, her expression thoughtful. "Medically, it's excellent. This family is thriving in ways I wouldn't have predicted given the circumstances of their birth. The mother's recovery is ahead of schedule. The kittens are all stable, including the one we were most worried about, and there are no signs of infection or complications." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But from a wildlife rehabilitation standpoint, this presents a significant challenge." Marcus picked up the explanation. "Standard protocol in wildlife rehabilitation is to minimize human contact and prevent bonding between wild animals and domestic species. The goal is always to return animals to their natural habitat with their wild instincts intact, but what we have here," he gestured toward the shelter where Pip still lay curled against the Bobcat kittens, "is the opposite of that. This mother has formed a bond not just with humans, but with domestic cats. She's integrated them into her concept of safety and family." Lisa added her perspective. "We have to consider what's best for this Bobcat family long term. If we move them to our facility now, we break the bonds that have formed here, potentially causing stress that could set back the mother's recovery. But if we leave them here too long, we risk creating dependencies that could prevent successful release. It's a decision that requires balancing immediate welfare against future wild viability." Elena turned to Margaret directly. "I need to know if you're prepared for what I'm about to propose. It's unconventional, possibly unprecedented in wildlife rehabilitation protocols, and it will require significant commitment from you." Margaret felt her heart rate increase. "Whatever it is," she said firmly, "I'll do it. These cats of mine made a choice to help this family. I'm not going to abandon them now." The proposal that Elena outlined over the next 30 minutes was radical by any standard of wildlife care. Instead of moving the Bobcat family to the rehabilitation center, Elena suggested creating a transitional rehabilitation space right here in Margaret's backyard. They would set up a large outdoor enclosure, the kind used for pre-release conditioning of wild cats, but with some modifications that would allow Margaret's cats to maintain controlled contact with the Bobcat family during the critical early weeks. The theory, Elena explained, was that the domestic cats had essentially become surrogate support for the mother Bobcat during her most vulnerable time. Breaking that support system abruptly could cause more harm than good. But as the mother regained her strength and the kittens grew, the contact could be gradually reduced, allowing the wild family to rebuild their natural independence while still benefiting from the unique safe environment that had formed here. There would be conditions, of course. Margaret would need to undergo training in wildlife handling and care. Her backyard would need to be secured and modified to meet state wildlife rehabilitation standards. Elena and her team would maintain constant supervision for the first 2 weeks, with regular check-ins thereafter. Most importantly, Margaret would need to accept that this arrangement was temporary, that the ultimate goal remained the release of the Bobcat family back into appropriate wild habitat once they were ready. Margaret listened to all the requirements, the potential costs, the time commitment, the legal paperwork that would need to be filed with state and federal wildlife agencies. She thought about her quiet retirement, her peaceful routine, her simple life with her 6 cats. This would change everything, turn her home into something between a residence and a rehabilitation facility, subject her to oversight and regulation, consume her time and resources. Then she looked at the scene in her backyard, the mother Bobcat resting peacefully with her 4 spotted kittens and 1 orange one pressed against her side, Oliver standing guard with dignified authority, Patches maintaining her maternal vigil, the other cats positioned around the yard like sentinels. This unlikely family that had formed through crisis and compassion, this impossible bond that defied nature's usual boundaries. When she turned back to Elena, her decision was clear. "I'll do whatever it takes," Margaret said simply. Elena nodded, a small smile crossing her face. "I thought you might say that." She pulled out her phone and began making calls, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform Margaret's backyard over the next week into a state-approved temporary rehabilitation site. The process moved quickly once it began. The Wildlife Center donated a large modular enclosure system, the kind that could be expanded or reconfigured as needed. Local volunteers, drawn by news of the unusual rescue, showed up to help with construction and setup. Margaret's neighbors, initially concerned about having a wild bobcat on the block, became supporters once they understood the temporary nature of the arrangement and the remarkable circumstances that had led to it. By the end of the first week, a sophisticated outdoor habitat had been created in Margaret's backyard. The enclosure was large enough to give the Bobcat family room to move and grow, but designed with sections that could be opened or closed to control interaction with the domestic cats. There were climbing structures, hiding spots, and separate feeding areas. One section connected to Margaret's garage, where a warm indoor space had been prepared for cold nights or bad weather. The mother Bobcat, whom Margaret had privately begun calling Grace for the grace she'd shown in trusting such unlikely helpers, adapted to the enclosure with surprising ease. Perhaps because it had been constructed around the spot where she'd given birth, or perhaps because her domestic cat allies still had access to certain areas, Grace seemed to accept her new accommodations as an extension of the safe space she'd already claimed. Her recovery continued at a remarkable pace, her body regaining the lean muscle and sleek coat that characterized healthy bobcats. The 4 bobcat kittens grew rapidly, their eyes opening at around 10 days old to reveal the characteristic blue that would eventually change to amber. They were perfect miniature versions of their mother, their spotted coats becoming more defined with each passing day. The kitten that had struggled so desperately in its first hours, the one Pip had devoted himself to saving, showed no lasting effects from its difficult start. Elena had begun calling it Phoenix, a name that Margaret felt captured the miracle of its survival. Pip's role in the Bobcat family evolved as the kittens grew stronger. The mother still allowed him access to her babies, and the tiny orange kitten spent hours each day playing gently with his adopted siblings, teaching them games that domestic kittens play. It was an education in social behavior that would normally come from other bobcat kittens in a larger litter, and Elena noted with fascination how these play sessions seemed to benefit the wild kitten's development. Oliver maintained his supervisory position, though as Grace regained her strength and confidence, the big tabby gradually increased his distance, giving the wild mother space to reclaim her independence. It was a masterclass in gentle boundary setting, allowing Grace to feel supported while never imposing himself on her territory. Patches continued her interest in the kittens, often sitting at the enclosure mesh and watching their antics with maternal approval. As October turned to November and then December, the Bobcat kittens grew from helpless newborns into active, curious youngsters. At 8 weeks, they were climbing the structures in their enclosure, pouncing on leaves and practicing the hunting skills that would eventually ensure their survival in the wild. Grace had become an attentive and skilled mother, teaching her babies everything they would need to know, her wild instincts fully intact despite the unusual circumstances of their early days. The controlled contact with the domestic cats was gradually reduced according to Elena's carefully designed protocol. By the time the Bobcat kittens were 3 months old, they saw Margaret's cats only through the mesh of the enclosure, no longer sharing the same space. Pip had been the hardest to separate from his adopted siblings, the little orange kitten meowing plaintively for several days when he could no longer curl up with Phoenix and the others. But gradually, he accepted the change, content to sit on the opposite side of the mesh and purr at his wild friends. Margaret had completed her wildlife handling certification and had become adept at the daily care routines that kept the rehabilitation program running smoothly. Elena visited twice weekly, bringing fresh food supplies and conducting health assessments. The Bobcat family thrived under this care, growing stronger and wilder. With each passing week, Grace had fully recovered her wild wariness, no longer seeking comfort from humans or domestic cats, yet she retained a tolerance for their presence that would make the eventual release process easier. In February, 5 months after that dramatic afternoon, when a desperate pregnant bobcat had collapsed on Margaret's lawn, Elena made the announcement that everyone had been both hoping for and dreading. The Bobcat family was ready for release. Grace was in peak condition, fully capable of hunting and surviving in the wild. Her kittens, now robust juveniles weighing between 15 and 18 pounds, had developed all the skills they would need. Elena had already scouted release sites, finding a protected area of wilderness with established bobcat territory, adequate prey populations, and minimal human contact. The night before the release, Margaret sat in her backyard watching the Bobcat family through the enclosure mesh. Grace was grooming her kittens with thorough efficiency, preparing them for the journey ahead in the only way she knew. The 4 young bobcats tolerated their mother's attention with varying degrees of patience, occasionally wrestling with each other or pouncing on imaginary prey. Phoenix, the kitten whose life had hung by such a fragile thread in those first hours, was now the most adventurous of the litter, climbing higher and exploring more boldly than any of its siblings. Pip sat beside Margaret on the bench, his small body warm against her leg. The orange kitten, now 7 months old and substantially larger than he'd been when this all began, watched his adopted family with calm eyes. Margaret wondered what the little cat understood of what was about to happen, whether he knew that tomorrow he would say goodbye to the wild kittens he'd helped save. As if sensing her thoughts, Pip looked up at her and began to purr, that same remarkable purr that had brought life back into a failing bobcat kitten 5 months ago. The release took place at dawn in a remote section of the Roosevelt National Forest. Grace was transported in a specialized crate that allowed her kittens to remain with her. Minimizing their stress, Margaret had been given permission to attend along with Elena, Marcus, and Lisa. When the crate door was opened, Grace emerged cautiously, her kittens following close behind. She paused at the edge of the tree line, looking back one final time at the humans who had saved her life and enabled her to save her babies. Then, with fluid grace, she disappeared into the wilderness, her 4 spotted kittens vanishing after her like smoke. The forest swallowed them completely within seconds, as if they'd never been in human care at all. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of joy and loss that she couldn't quite name. Elena placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, understanding without words what this moment meant. The story of Grace, Pip, and the impossible rescue spread far beyond Boulder. It became a testament to the unexpected ways that compassion could cross boundaries, to the remarkable intelligence and empathy that animals possessed, and to the difference that one small act of courage could make. Wildlife rehabilitation centers across the country studied Elena's protocols, incorporating elements of controlled interspecies support into their programs. Research papers were published examining Pip's therapeutic purring and its measurable effects on the struggling kitten's survival. But for Margaret, sitting in her peaceful backyard with her 6 cats arranged around her, the story was simpler than all that analysis. It was about a pregnant mother who'd chosen to trust when trust seemed impossible, about a tiny kitten who'd given everything to save a life, about family, however unusual its composition might be. As she watched Oliver groom Pip with gentle, deliberate strokes, watched Patches doze in the autumn sun, watched her other cats pursue their various peaceful activities, Margaret understood that some bonds transcended explanation. Somewhere in the forest, Grace was teaching her kittens to hunt, to survive, to thrive in their natural world. And in a suburban backyard in Boulder, a small orange cat purred contentedly, his heroic heart beating steady and strong, forever changed by the wild family he'd helped bring into the world.